Hello everybody, welcome back to another light novel review. Today I'm talking about volume number 8 in Fujino Omori's light novel series, Is It Wrong to Try to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon, which we shortened to make it a lot easier and called Danmachi. Now, this one is the short story volume, and it's funny to call it short story when it's like almost double the length of your average light novel, but the structure of this book is a lot different from the previous volumes of Danmachi, where we've had, well, I guess there was the one volume that was similar. I guess it was volume, 4, where we did have sort of a long story, and then there were sort of two short stories at the end. This one structurally are a series of shorter stories, but it's all kind of connected over with this overarching story about a country called Rakia, which is invading Orario, being led by the god of war Ares, who is the singular deity of the nation of Rakia. So this war sort of is a backdrop to a lot of the events that are going on in the book. Some of the stories are very directly tied to that invasion and very heavily influenced by it. Others, it's a very just sort of backdrop to it, and it really doesn't play a whole lot into the short story itself. One of the ways that this is a lot different is that from other short story volumes that we've had in the past is, first of all, the book is still chronological. So it's not like we jump over different time periods or that this story takes place at a different time than this story and so forth. It is still chronological, and it is still chronological in terms of the series. So this is still, every single one of these stories is still set after volume number 7. Some of it is still dealing with the aftermaths of, volume number 6. It is still a really integral part of the Danmachi series. This isn't really like one of those fluff volumes that you could bypass and just get on with the rest of the actual story in volume number 9. Instead, this sort of volume, it ends up being a lot more about building characters. So each of these stories seems to focus on one particular character. Obviously, Belle plays into a lot of these stories, but we have stories that figure very heavily with Wealth. We have a story that figures very prominently with Lily. We have one that Mikoto is very prominent in. Of course, one that I wouldn't say Hestia is exactly like she's very active in the story, but it isn't as much like a focal point story on her as the other ones are. There's even one with Aina, who is, of course, Belle's sort of mentor at the guild, his advisor. There's a story that focuses on her. Love, romance is very much a theme for the majority of these stories, and yes, of course, some of them do kind of continue the whole let's build a harem around Belle thing, where it talks about, certain characters having feelings towards Belle, but it's also talking about feelings that other characters have. For instance, Mikoto, it's dealing with sort of her unresolved feelings towards her god from her previous Familia, and perhaps even like a little bit of that uncomfortableness about how she left that family to join in to Hestia's in order to help them and repay the debt she felt that she was obligated to. There is a really big one that deals with Wealth and deals with a whole lot of background on him and sort of his backstory, and I think kind of resolves a lot of issues with Wealth. It's actually it's one of the stronger sort of stories that are in this book, in terms of definitely building up a character who's been with us for quite a few books, has played a pretty integral role. It really shows how he became the person he is, why he feels the way he does about the work that he will do and the work that he won't do when it comes to like magic swords. We of course have this story that's sort of like a romantic comedy that it's hard to explain without getting into spoilers. Again, just kind of read it. So romance, love, this whole idea of feelings between children and their deities, the deities and their children, how that relationship works, how it evolves, the different forms that it can take. There are some really, really good moments in this book. And I would say that while definitely some of the stories are stronger than others, like for instance, Mikoto's I think is the weakest of all of them, which it works out pretty well because it's the very first one in the book. So the book only kind of gets better, I think, from that point. But every one of the stories has, I think, a good and decent point to it and accomplishes a really good goal of building up these secondary characters that we don't often get as much time with because, of course, the main story of Danmachi is very much Belle's rise to becoming a hero. And so we get this time with these other characters. We get these backstories. We get to be more in their heads and see what their motivations are. And there's some good laughs. There's some, kind of really like very almost like, well, I mean, maybe I'm just dead inside, but I mean, there are definitely some more like touching moments, some very good moments between characters that really helps to kind of solidify relationships. And when you read the afterword, Omori says that this is the end of the second arc as far as he's concerned. So this book is sort of the end cap on the second arc, and then we are going to begin a new arc in the next book. And it really does feel that way. It kind of feels like we're tying up a lot of loose ends, that we're sort of deciding where relationships sit between all of these different characters, how the characters are going to live with those relationships going forward, and kind of just, again, just settling these loose ends and getting us to a point where we're at sort of a good, even, steady point before we continue on into the third arc. Now, if you love this series for dungeon diving, you're going to be disappointed because there is really not much dungeon diving at all. Of course, we talk about the dungeon lots, but we really don't spend a whole lot of time in the dungeon in this one. I think really Lily's story is probably the most time that we spend in the dungeon, a little bit with Mikoto, but after that, I'd say probably 2/3 of the novel we do not spend in the dungeon at all. It was kind of nice to have this sort of invading country, Rakia, and it kind of expanded the world a little bit. I mean, we've heard in the other books about there being these other nations and everything else, but we've really been so focused on Orario itself that in order to kind of see the broader world, this bigger world aspect, and how gods, their presence can actually influence and change other nations, it was kind of a fun and interesting thing to see how that played out in terms of sort of expanding the scope and the worldview of the series and kind of getting outside of the walls a little bit and seeing what kind of world is out there. So all in all, I have to say, like, I have in the past skipped short story volumes. I skipped Sword Art Online's short story volume. I've been kind of putting off The Devil is a Part-Timer. I've got it. I've got to read it soon, though, because the next volume's coming out soon. I've been putting off Excel World's latest one, which is short stories. I'm not a big one for that kind of stuff, and I think it's because, for the most part, I'm usually interested in the story moving forward, and so reading these little side stories that are very inconsequential, it never really grabs me that much. This one, though, like I said, I was a little bit surprised. It really is, it feels more like a volume of Danmachi, where we're moving ahead, where we're advancing the characters and their relationships. There's events that happen in this book that are sure to sort of influence and play out in future volumes. But it's just the way that it's set up and structured that is quite different. And yeah, it's easy to say that they're short stories. And, given that, like I said, it's a pretty hefty book, it's kind of nice because you get to the end of a story and you can kind of walk away from it for a minute because you feel like you actually accomplished something. Whereas the last couple volumes of Danmachi that have been almost this same width or same length, they're really hard to put down when it's a continuous story. It's hard to find that point where you feel like, yes, I can walk away now. So all in all, I was impressed by this. I liked it a lot better than I thought I would. Like I said, definitely some of the stories very, stronger than others, but overall, I think there were definitely some highs and good points in all of the stories. It's just some were far more consistent in terms of their quality than others, and in terms of, really feeling like there was a point and that they were very much still driving the narrative of Danmachi forward. So those are my thoughts on volume number 8 of Is It Wrong to Try to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon? My next one that I am going to read is actually going to be, again, I'm trying to get caught up on series that I've kind of let slide, and I'm going to be going to volume number 2 of, and of course it went small again, In Another World with My Smartphone. Of course, the anime is playing for this one right now. I did read volume number 1. I enjoyed it. It was light. It was fluffy. And honestly, coming after a heavy, big volume like that, I'm thinking maybe light and fluffy isn't such a bad thing. So volume number 2 of In Another World with My Smartphone will be the next book that I read. So if you're brand new to the channel and you love light novels, don't forget to subscribe so you can check out all of my future light novel reviews, including future light novels of reviews of Danmachi and, of course, of In Another World with My Smartphone in my next video. Thank you all for joining me in this one. I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, bye-bye for now.